If you look at the state of where we are right now in networking, I would say we're kind of like the self-driving car state. No one's quite ready to hand over the keys of their network, to a virtual AI assistant, but they're starting to leverage it. Same way we do for our self-driving cars. We appreciate the fact that it keeps us in line, keeps us so many feet away. So I think that's where we are in the enterprise space now, where enterprises are now just looking at AI as another step in the evolution of automation. And they're starting to play with it and get to know it. And they're starting to leverage it for certain use cases now to help them manage their network.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to and watching another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today I'm speaking with Bob Friday, who is co-founder of Mist Systems and Chief AI Officer at Juniper Networks. Bob, thanks so much for joining me today. Yeah, before we get into cloud AI ops and what you're doing at Mist and Juniper today, can you share a little bit of background on yourself? I think the everyday person, a lot of consumers had their first experience of AI relatively recently, but nearly everyone I have on this show has had a long history and a long career in AI. So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey with AI?
Yeah, so my standard joke being is 40 years ago, I started a career as a wireless engineer, building mesh networks and everything. And if you'd bet $1 that I'd end my career as a chief AI officer, you'd be a millionaire now. But anyway, yeah, so my path was, for those who've been around, Metcom Ricochet, we were building these wireless nationwide networks. Then I started a company called Airspace that was focused on wireless controllers for the enterprise, and then sold that to Cisco. That was back in the early 2000s. Then I left Cisco to really start Mist, and that was really the beginnings of my journey into cloud AI ops, basically bringing a new architecture into the networking space, between cloud and AI. That this is finally a different way to help manage these networks.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, your perspective on the state of enterprise AI today, maybe through the view of cloud networks.
Yeah, if you look at the state of where we are right now in networking, I would say we're kind of like the self-driving car state. No one's quite ready to hand over the keys of their network, to a virtual AI assistant, but they're starting to leverage it. Same way we do for our self-driving cars. We appreciate the fact that it keeps us in line, keeps us so many feet away. So I think that's where we are in the enterprise space now, where enterprises are now just looking at AI as another step in the evolution of automation. And they're starting to play with it and get to know it. And they're starting to leverage it for certain use cases now to help them manage their network. Same way AI helps you drive your car down the street.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I guess, how would you describe the impact of AI on network automation, and what are some of the use cases that you're seeing the most success with?
What I usually tell people is that when you look at AI is kind of the next step in the evolution of automation. The major step here is, in the past, when we built things, they were very deterministic, right? We would build a robot to basically do some repetitive function. In a networking space, we built scripts, right? We wrote these scripts that would basically configure something or do something, and it did the same thing every day and night. The major disruption with AI is right now we're basically doing automation that is really starting to automate cognitive reasoning, right? We're starting to build solutions that can do things on par with humans. And an example of this is in the networking space. We're now building solutions. We're building these large experience models, very similar to large language models, where we're now training very large models with billions of video collaboration data points that can predict someone's user experience, Zoom, Teams user experience, right? And so once you can actually predict that, this is where what I call the canary in the coal mine. These very large models now are helping IT teams solve problems. Like one of our customers, they had a problem out in one of their sites in India. They couldn't figure it out, right? Basically, they were getting complaints about their Zoom calls. Once we had this large experience model built, what we quickly were able to deduce was basically it was a misconfigured VPN gateway. They were basically for certain users, they were routing packets from India to Australia, adding latency and jitter that was screwing up the Zoom experience. That's an example where AI and these large models are doing the same thing a human could do, but it would take a human months to go sort through all the data to get that correlation. That is where these large models are starting to really disrupt in the networking space.
I love that example. I have two questions based on that I want to touch on. One is, You mentioned deterministic, right? We're moving from a world where you have like deterministic programming towards something like large language models or these large experience models, which are probability based primarily, right? They're statistical systems. How are you dealing with some of the limitations of that in terms of predictability and reliability? And second, am I hearing you right that in terms of would a large experience model like one you've trained, is that turning the signals that you have in your network almost into like a vector database and being able to, like, in the same way that large language models do that sort of thing? Or how does that actually work?
Yeah. So when you go under the hood, like this large experience model, what we're doing there is we're actually taking data, end-to-end user experience data from Zoom or Teams, and we're joining that data with the network features in your network. And so that usually consists of data from your client, from your wireless link, from your switch link, from your WAN link, right? And then you're building a model that can, once you have a model that can accurately predict, your audio, video, latency, jitter, that's when you start to use techniques called Shapley. This is what I call fancy math. This is that fancy AI math. Now it can tell you which network feature is actually contributing to a user's performance or a site performance problem. For me, when people say the word AI, that's a concept, right? That's not an algorithm. That is a concept of doing something on par with a human. The actual math is what enables doing something on par. And that's what Shapley brings to the table, right? It's basically finding that canary in the coal mine, that needle in the haystack of what is causing this Zoom Teams problem, which feature in the model is actually best prediction. And the interesting thing with this is once you have these models built, and that's why it's very similar to like large language models, where we're building models that can actually predict the next word in a sentence. These models, when they get large enough, they start to kind of illustrate reasoning. When you use ChatGPT, you're like, how did it do that? And that's the magic of these large models, is they actually start to actually simulate some of the cognitive reasoning skill. In the network space, that's what we're similarly doing with these large experience models, building models that can basically find the needle in the haystack that would take an IT team, weeks or months to find.
Interesting. Okay. So still wrapping my head around that, as I'm sure some of the audience is, but that's a very, very interesting use case. And I think one thing that we see a lot in the industry, right, is often large language models are not really doing logical, formal reasoning in the way that we might think about like symbolic logic and kind of reliable, traceable things, right? They're predicting words and they can kind of mimic reasoning in some ways. How do you feel about that in connection to what you're doing with these large experience models? Do you have observability? How are you building those systems to ensure that for your customers and your networks, they're essentially predicting reliably?
So, I think that's back to that Shapley. That Shapley is what's providing observability and reasoning and what's doing the feature prediction. If we go back to our large language model discussion, right, that is really what we're, as we talked about, is really becoming the next generation of user interface. More and more so in the networking space, what you saw happening here is, when I started my career 20 years ago, it was all about the CLI, command line interface. We were typing in commands to program AP switches and routers. And then we slowly transitioned to dashboards to make people's life easier. So you didn't have to know all this command language to help manage all this stuff. Really, that large language model and Gen AI, that is really taking the user interface and making it easier for people to get access to data. And that's part of that, to your point, the reasoning, the large language model itself. And what we're seeing in the networking space is this auto agent technology, right? This is where people are starting to break problems into smaller subsets. They're almost using large language models as a programming element, almost a function call now, and helping solve problems.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the space. You mentioned conversational interfaces. I had someone on the show just last week. The episode's not out yet, but talking about building a lot of that for their customers in the sense that dashboards, you need to know how to look at a dashboard. You need to be trained in that way. You need to know what to look for to really extract much insight. But building ML models using LLMs to help query these large, this very large amount of data and actually extract insight from it, I think is one of the most interesting use cases that we're going to see develop for this, because it just democratizes access to some of the underlying data, which is very difficult to get to, and the insight. As you're building this kind of what's been called an AI native network platform. How are you evolving to meet the demands of modern enterprise networks? I think you've touched on it a little bit. Is there anything else that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would highlight, especially in the enterprise space right now, when people say the word AI, nowadays they almost mean Gen AI. When they say AI, and I think inside of the enterprise space is, even here at Juniper, most companies, Gen AI has got both a customer facing aspect and an internal aspect. So most enterprises, if you go to their leadership team, you'll find out they've got two missions. One is basically making sure that their organization is using Gen AI to increase operational efficiency. And that's happening, I think, across almost all enterprises right now, is trying to figure out how to use Gen AI to make their supply chain, their HR, engineering, make each department more efficient. And then for enterprises like ourselves, where we're actually at customer facing, we're actually starting to use Gen AI along with our other AI more about helping our customers solve problems. So I think, for most enterprises, there's both an external facing and an internal facing effort going on right now with their AI strategies.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you that right now what we're seeing is often conflating AI as a term and as a discipline with Gen AI, when there's obviously a lot of different tools within that umbrella. At Juniper specifically, you mentioned this distinction between internal use cases and customer facing use cases, solving customer problems. A big thing that I've read in what Juniper has put out is a lot of emphasis on user experience, right? And you even mentioned that in your example of, it starts with, the experience on Zoom and then trying to troubleshoot that through what's going on in the network. How is that influencing your approach to developing AI solutions, this kind of focus on user experience?
Yeah, interesting when I got into this. Like I said, before Mist, I had started a company called Aerospace 20 years ago. And when I was at Cisco, I was actually working with some very large customers, and a couple told me, hey, Bob, we are not going to put your controller-based technology onto, I was trying to get them to do a customer experience, right? They said they were going to put a critical app onto this network until I could stop the controllers from crashing. I had to make sure that I could deliver code, more than once or twice a year. But more importantly, had to guarantee to them that, the user was going to have a great experience on the network. And that was kind of that aha moment around, hey, you know what? There's a paradigm shift. Yes, we have to keep all these network elements green, but what's more important is making sure that the user or that critical business app is really having a great experience on the network. And that's when you kind of got this is really a cloud AI ops. And when you look what's going on in the enterprise, the cloud brings that reliability. When you move your applications into the cloud, you're inheriting the reliability and redundancy of a cloud architecture. And you're basically being able to do code releases every week, every other week, as opposed to you're releasing, innovating much faster. And then the AI is bringing that next step of automation across it, right? We're basically building an end-to-end solution right now that is basically keeping track of that user experience from client to cloud. And probably the big difference 20 years ago when I did this, I was basically I was sending data back, to the controllers, trying to keep track of what the EP of the switch was doing. But this time around, it's more about, instead of synchronous, we also send user state back. There's a lot more streaming telemetry coming back on both the user state and the device state. And that's probably the biggest shift when you move to a user experience, is everything starts with the user, what I call the user minute, right? You're basically starting with each user minute and aggregating up from there. And that's when you start doing AI. Once you have the data in the right format, then you can start to apply AI and fancy math to the data.
As this goes fully into the cloud and you're looking at cloud AI ops, you're working in the enterprise, I have to imagine that the security privacy question comes up all the time. Like, how are you dealing with that at Juniper?
Security and privacy are the same, two sides of the same coin. Now, interestingly, when you move to the cloud, we went through the whole privacy issue, right? GDPR in Europe. And most customers are now comfortable with moving applications and data into the cloud. And usually especially here at Juniper Mist, right? We're not really moving personal data to the cloud. The data we're moving to the cloud is device state and user state. So we're not moving personal information. And usually it takes a security audit. When we engage with enterprise customers, there's a security team. And it does take a little while to understand, first of all, what data we're moving to the cloud. And then they want to make sure that everything is encrypted, SOC compliance when that data moves to cloud. So I think that is one of the big issues. It's a hurdle to get over with. And usually I tell customers there is too much value in moving to the cloud, and getting over the security fears. It's worth the time and effort. You got to work with your security team and get them comfortable with moving to the cloud.
Would you say the same goes for integrating some of the AI components into that in terms of using your large experience models, things like that, that the value of doing that far outweighs the potential risks or the fears that they might have in sharing that data?
Yeah, I think AI is similar. The concerns people have around AI is more around ethics. There's kind of privacy and security. When you get to AI, there's also an ethics discussion of, hey, make sure that when you're training the model, did you introduce any bias in the model? They want to make, and I'd say it's more a worry about HR applications. So if you look what's going on in Europe right now, Europe just came out with a new law around AI and new rules about AI. And it's kind of a risk pyramid, where they basically segregate the applications to different levels of risk. If I'm building a car or a plane, that's a higher level of risk, and they have different rules that apply to that. If I'm building something that is going to make loan decisions or HR decisions, that has a high level risk. So they have kind of this low, medium, high level risk for these AI applications that we're seeing. And so that discussion is happening also right now. And I suspect by, next year sometime, similar to what we see here with UL and CE marks, if you're building an AI product and you go to Europe, you're going to have a CE mark. Just like we do right now. You're going to have to make sure that whatever you build is safe for safe for your customers.
Yeah, I think the regulatory environment will adapt rapidly, and the EU obviously tends to focus more heavily on protection and regulation than the US will at first. But I'm sure we're going to see the landscape evolve quickly. Shifting a little bit away from customer-focused applications and more in terms of operations, within your own business at Juniper, in your role as Chief AI Officer, how do you help the business identify which areas of operations would benefit the most from integration?
Here inside of Juniper, we actually have a team right now dedicated to figuring out where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck, right? With Gen AI, whether it's in engineering around code development, in marketing, it's really around content creation and operations. There's effort going around how much Gen AI can help with our supply chain activities. And even in the legal aspect, they're starting to look at Gen AI to help with that. I would say probably at the top of the list right now is software development. There looks to be a big help in productivity around using Gen AI to get to more reliable code. And then there's the natural fear there is making sure there is no data IP leakage. So I usually break these applications into applications that want to be internal, you don't want the data to leave your network, or if it's some sort of public doc search application, where it's okay to send your data off to ChatGPT, OpenAI, or Microsoft. So that's how we're helping inside of Juniper right now, is going through and testing these applications. Probably the other one's the obvious one. I don't know if have you used Microsoft Copilot yet?
I've tinkered. I can't say I'm a heavy user because I'm not a developer, but yeah.
That's probably the other obvious one that enterprises are dealing with right now. Is it worth giving every employee access to Microsoft Copilot? Now, for me personally, for meeting summarization, it's totally changed the game. It's amazing what now you do, for all these meetings, you can basically have your Microsoft Copilot basically summarize, or Zoom summarize those meetings for you and give you a summary after every meeting.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting use cases. The summary in particular adds so much value. I've read somewhere about the coding copilots also introducing a lot of bad code into systems. I think it's going to be very interesting as we see the wide scale adoption of these systems, what the actual ramifications are. But I'd love to understand, you mentioned the different use cases primarily, but when you're thinking about prioritizing and budget, how do you think about which ones to bet on and which investments are worth making?
Well, and I would say right now, inside of Juniper, and I suspect this is true in other enterprise customers, they're actually doing pilot tests right now in each group, right? And they're starting to look at the impact of, can we actually get code in Jira's closed faster? Engineers using Copilot, are they closing code faster? And to your point, right? I don't think anyone is a hands-off self-driving Gen AI. There's still an engineer involved, making sure that the code is correct. So it's not replacing engineers from scratch. What it's really doing is making them more productive, or making young engineers or new engineers productive faster, is what we're seeing right now.
Okay. And it sounds like based on a lot of the other use cases that you outlined, it's usually tied to some sort of productivity metric related to that employee's time or yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's metrics. I mean, everyone has metrics inside of the company to see how productive, in our networking space, right? What we're doing with Juniper Mist here around network operations, right? The metric is fewer support tickets and time to resolve support tickets, right? And that's usually our metric of, are we making progress? Where is AI helping? How much is it helping?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And as you help companies kind of assess the readiness of their existing infrastructure to support use cases, not so much the ones you just mentioned internally, but more the customer facing ones in terms of, detecting issues with your network and helping engineers fix them. How do you help them assess whether they're ready to do that or not?
Yeah. And so right now, what I tell customers, and if they're looking for networking AI ops, cloud AI ops help, the first questions they should ask is, is their vendor actually using the tool themselves and their support team? Because when we move to the cloud, ultimately, when you look at Juniper Mist here, our customer support team is a proxy for our customers. The fewer tickets that our support team sees is the fewer tickets our customers are sending us. And so usually, when I talk to customers about trying to evaluate, it's really about asking, is the vendor actually using it themselves? Because we have data about how much it's actually helping our support team reduce support tickets. And then probably the other rule is, get to a production POC as fast as you can. The challenge is all the AI, all the PowerPoint starts to look the same for most customers. So you got to quickly just sort through this. You really need to get to a production POC to actually see the true value of cloud AI ops. And that's what I found with most customers. So once they get it up and running in a production environment, then they start to get that aha moment of, hey, observability, once the data is in the cloud, they actually appreciate how much more data and visibility they get. And then when they actually start using the AI ops, they start to appreciate the value of the fancy math. Where can it help them get to that needle in the haystack faster? How can it reduce the noise of the raw events? All these network events. You want to be able to sort through those network events and get down to some actionable events, insights you can actually work against. And that was probably the biggest problem in IT, right? They were overwhelmed with network events. There was thousands of network events. You practically didn't know where to start when you came in the morning.
One thing we're seeing a lot in the industry is just the sheer volume of Gen AI pilots going on right now in the enterprise,
Yes.
right? You, as you said it, every board is now talking about this. What are we doing with Gen AI? What are our strategic initiatives? And I think there's a scramble and there's all these POCs starting, but we're also seeing a lot of these POCs stall or really not move out of that stage, right? Because they're not necessarily proving enough value in the enterprise. How are you moving a lot of the work with your customers past that stage and into full scale deployment? Is that a conversation you're having, and how does it go?
Yeah, that's what I call a conversation. And what we're doing, where we're helping customers is what I call human validation. And I think that's what people are finding. Getting a POC, getting a Gen AI POC up and running is relatively quick now. And almost any engineer who writes Python code can have a POC up and running in days. The real challenge is efficacy. And that's where the real work starts. Okay, guys, we need to get human validation up and running. We need to start optimizing these solutions because it's not deterministic. And that's what I think I mentioned before. If you look at LLM as a programming functional element, the big difference is usually when you're doing a software program, the function is very deterministic. There's an input, there's an output. When we start working with these LLMs, there's not a deterministic output. It's very dependent on the prompt and very other factors you created. You're trying to optimize this LLM to actually do the job of a real person, right? And that's what I tell people is when you look at the virtual assistants of the future, it's going to be like hiring an intern, right? When you hire someone, you need to get to know what they're capable of, right? You got to understand what their skill, and you got to know what they're capable of learning. And that's probably the big difference between what we've done in the past with automation and what we're doing now with AI, Gen AI, is we're starting to build solutions that look and feel much more like a human, that you're adding someone to your team now.
Yeah, a helpful way to look at it. I think that the fact that they're not deterministic in nature is what makes them so powerful for people to interact with, but it's also what makes them such a problem in some ways to implement at scale for enterprises. So it's a very interesting time.
So I always have people tell me, hey, Bob, what about that? What about hallucinations? What happens if your Gen AI hallucinates? And I always remind them, it's like, how often have you had a new employee do something and go, what the heck were they thinking? It's like, how often does your human employee actually hallucinate and do something like can't make sense of?
Well, that's to go back to your point about ethical, considerations, right? Being responsibly and implementing AI, making sure that we, have the right controls in place, or that we're holding systems accountable in the same way that we hold humans accountable, is going to be more and more important as well.
On the ethics thing, I think the other interesting thing is going to be more around probably liability. You think about when we get to self-driving cars, if there's an accident, who's responsible? So I think those are the issues we're going to be dealing with as we move more and more into this building solutions that are doing jobs on par with humans, right? Although I do think there will be a day where you can't get a driver's license. I think there will be a day when the self-driving car becomes safer than the actual human driver, and they'll make it illegal for you to drive.
That's possible. Hopefully there will still be some other job for humans to do, and I'm sure there will be, because we are boundless in our creativity once we've automated away the other parts of the job. I mean, as we wrap up the episode, do you have any advice for businesses that are looking to integrate AI into their operations? What would you tell them to ensure a successful implementation?
I would tell them, if you're going to start your production POC, really focus on the human validation component of it. There's a lot of technology options out there. I think people tend to overlook how they're going to validate it, and actually how they're going to create, keep improving the efficacy, right? Because these solutions we're building, like I said, are very similar to humans. When you hire a new employee, you're going to invest time and energy, in that employee to make it better. I think you should treat your AI solution the same way. You have to basically figure out how to measure it, have those reviews just like you do for an employee, right? You have monthly, quarterly reviews to see how they're doing, and then you actually try to work on improving it. And I think that's where we are with AI now.
Yeah, a very interesting perspective on how to manage that going forward, particularly in the Gen AI space. Bob, thanks so much for your time today. That's all we have time for. But if people want to follow you and your work, where's the best place for them to go?
I would say the best way for them, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Bob Friday, always happy to talk about cloud AIOps, and ping me on LinkedIn and happy to chat.
Well, you heard it. That was Bob Friday from Juniper Networks. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, and don't hesitate to send me a message as well if you listen to the episode and have any feedback. Thanks again for listening today, and see you next episode.